What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Leo from Black Swamp Comics, and back again. As you guys probably seen on my last video, I've been listing that as private, and I just want to tell you guys why I did that. So a lot of my videos where I talk about more sensitive materials, more controversial stuff, I usually end up listening to that stuff private because of my audience. Usually I get about 30 views. I pay attention to you guys too as well. So I know that about 30 views for each video, consistent, like on whatever I put. So there's 30 of you that are rocking with me on the usual basis, and I appreciate you guys. That's awesome. For some of my other videos that get more views, it's usually stuff that gets released on whatever, like New Comic Book Day, Omnibus, or whatever. And usually it's people looking for those specific videos that end up watching those. But like I said, 30 of you guys are always rocking with me, so I'm always comfortable releasing some videos with more sensitive topics where I discuss more complex ideas with you guys. Once I hit those 30 views, then I go ahead and unlist it, or put it on private. Because once I reach that, because I feel like those 30 of you guys usually are know who I am, and know how I get sometimes, and I can lay some heavy shit on you guys, because you guys are there also when I'm like talking about some goofy shit. And then after that, I feel like it's just people just being like nosy or whatever, which is fine. I always welcome new discussion and stuff, but that comes at a risk of people taking things the wrong way, or trying to reduce things to small things, like attracting like a bunch of political, crazies or whatever. And you guys know who I'm talking about. The people who try to reduce everything to political stuff. They have their political goggles on, and everything is being filtered through that. I think that's like my worst nightmare, if I just have a comment section just full of a bunch of political stuff on there. So anyways, that's what I do. Once I hit those 30 views, it goes on private. I really don't want to be, I don't want to be famous like that. You know what I mean? I just appreciate you guys watching my stuff and keeping up with my stuff. I know that there's a lot of great content on YouTube, so there's always kind of a competition for your time. So I always appreciate your time. Anyways, with that being said, guys, let's talk about some more controversial shit. We're going to be talking about this book I read. You guys know that I recently took a trip to Maine. On my way to Maine, I listened to this audiobook called The Tencent Plague. And I'll put the author right here because I'm really bad with names. And I really liked this book. I really enjoyed it. I felt like it benefited me as a comic book collector. I felt like I grew as a comic book collector. And I feel like if you're like a collector that's been around for a very long time, and you know about a lot of stuff. Like if you bought your Grail like back in like 30 years ago off the rack, then you probably are familiar with a lot of the subjects. But I feel like there's so much stuff in this book that you can get something new out of it. Like I knew some of the stuff going into it. However, this book did such a great job of, introducing me to new stuff, and then kind of like merging it with the stuff I knew, like filling in the gaps that I was missing. So it's a more comprehensive timeline, I think. I highly recommend this for new collectors. Like if you're a new collector, I highly recommend this, like to check that out. And I think it'll make you a more savvy collector, a more learned collector. And I just to talk to some of you guys about the book, the big summary of it. It's basically like a history of comic books, starting from the golden age, and then kind of works its way up to modern. The book was written, I think, in 2008 or whatever. And I think a huge chunk of the book is about the Comics Code Authority and all the backlash and criticism that comic books received, especially during the 50s. and the book does a great job of doing the timeline where it like highlights like certain incidents that were like, all right, this stuff is starting to brew, it's starting to bubble, and then it kind of comes to a fever pitch like in the 50s, and that's when we had like book burnings, and you had the seduction of the innocent, which was like the one book that I think all comic book collectors should be familiar with, and that's the one that kind of like put the blame on comic books for all of society's problems, specifically juvenile delinquency. But I feel like that's like an old age problem, that you know that still goes on today. Like you can still see it today. Like, people were blaming rap music and NWA for all their problems back in the 90s. And then people were blaming Madonna in the 80s for all their problems. And then video games, Grand Theft Auto. And now it's like social media and TikTok and all this other stuff, Like people always blame media for, for all the issues that are going on to the world. But the medium always changes, you know what I mean? It always changes, and I just, and the problems still persist. I think the world's gotten better. I don't think it's necessarily a result of censorship from the books, but even the author of The Seduction of Innocent, like later on in his later years, he did like rewrite another book, and I forget the name of it, but he did say that he kind of regretted it, writing that book and just kind of starting all that. Because one thing that surprised me about this book was like just learning at how some of the most intensive book burnings, comic book burnings, were organized by students, like of comic book reading age, right? So I thought that was kind of weird, and I think that's why it was so effective too, because it was actually the people who were in the demographic that, the targeted demographic who was supposed to be reading, even though a lot of the material was a lot more mature at the time, were the people who were burning these books as well. So I think that was probably why it was so effective. Like that kind of understands like why a lot of the pre-code horror and a lot of the golden age stuff is so much more rare. One, because like back in those days, comic books were seen kind of like as junk food, as a consumable. It was kind of like a pop, right? No nutrients. You just drink it, just for pleasure, and then you get very little out of it, and then you throw it away, right? Or you just pass it on to someone else. And I think that's the way these comic books were seen at that time. So a lot of them got thrown away. But then also you had the issue where they came up with these book burnings, where people would just gather massive amounts of books and just throw them in a bonfire, just light them up, right? And then you ended up losing a whole bunch of books that way. And I feel like that's why a lot of it is like the more scarcity of the books. Also, that kind of helps me understand like why pre-code horror itself is like so valuable, because it was kind of like the center of all of this drama, right? So when you have a pre-code horror book, you're literally holding a piece of pop history, pop culture history, not just pop culture, but cultural history in general, literature history as well. Which kind of brings me to my next thing. One of the other big takeaways that I took from this book was my familiarization with Will Eisner. Like I've heard of the Eisner Award or whatever, but I never really knew who Will Eisner were. But what I really liked about him is that he was a golden age writer. He was actually like one of the first, he was like one of the people who really envisioned comic books to be more than just junk food for kids, right? He saw it as a way you could have legitimate literature being put in books. Like he saw it as a combination between like art and then the writing. They would come together to create something. Like he saw it as a work of art, and you could tell like because of he created The Shadow, which was kind of like detective work. I believe it's The Shadow. I might be wrong, but The Spirit. I'm sorry, The Spirit. The Shadow, someone else. I knew I was The Spirit. And so when he was create The Spirit, it was more of an adult, and it was more complex, and and all this stuff, and it makes me want to read those Golden Age books. I really thought that he was interesting. I think he was one of the people who was like a catalyst to pushing comic books to a new and higher extent. And I feel like because of Will Eisner, we got to have writers who took the medium seriously as well, and they approached it with, okay, this is a good literary medium that I can express true art and write great stories. Guys like Alan Moore, Frank Miller, and even those other guys who wrote a little bit more mature stuff as well. When we saw the renaissance of like horror books and stuff in the Bronze Age and later on in the Copper Age in the 80s. So that was something that I thought was pretty interesting. I also thought it was pretty interesting how, like, the way it was mapped out, all these early creators, how they were, it was pretty much a close-knit community. Like, for these creators, when they first started off, they all kind of knew each other. They kind of like all work with each other at some point. And how they were all just kind of like super involved in their own little world, to the point that they were kind of oblivious to the kind of discontent that was growing for comic books outside of their world. I thought that was kind of interesting. I also thought it was interesting that, I forget the name. Like I said, I'm bad with names, but the guy that was at the head of EC, I think his name was like, I want to say Ed Gaines, but that's a serial killer. I want to say, I think his name was Bill Gaines, or Bill G something. But he was actually like, I listened to some of the excerpts where he was kind of like trying to defend his comic books against the author of The Seduction of the Innocent. And he didn't do a very good job at it. Like, he was very blunt, I think, and I get what he was trying to say. But I think he didn't have he didn't do a good service or a good defense for his horror books. I also think that it's kind of interesting that the Code of Comics Authority and stuff it pretty much started by the comic books creators themselves, like the publishers. Like, they censored themselves. All right, like, they did this to themselves, and they did it to themselves so hard that, like, it was very difficult for them to come back from that. Like, and that's why now you kind of understand now why a lot of the Silver Age is like so kiddie and so infantile and so, childish and so difficult to read now. Like, a lot of the Silver Age, especially, I feel like the DC stuff, it's kind of very difficult to read. And now I understand as well, like, why superheroes were so big as well, because pretty much everything was outlawed. Everything, all the horror, crime, romance, a lot of the other stuff was like outlawed. Like, well, not outlawed, but like censored. A lot of places went under once the Comic Codes of Authority took over. A lot of places went under. Like, I think EC went under, and a lot of other horror, companies went under. So I thought that was crazy, and so then you could see like the companies like DC and Marvel that had good established superhero genre. Those were the ones that kind of thrived because they kind of put everything into the superhero genre, because that was still kind of seen as acceptable for children or whatever. But from what I took from this book is, back in the Golden Age when superheroes first arrived, Golden Age were, kind of blew up, and you had this, real enlightenment, but they were still kind of a relatively smaller part of comic books as compared as to like crime stories, police stories, and all these other great genres. And also surprised me like how many books were being printed every single week, like how much stuff was being released. I think it was like upwards of like, I think tens of millions of books per week. Can you guys imagine tens of millions of books being printed today on New Comic Book Day, like on braces? Like, a lot of books don't have that kind of a print count anymore. And it's just crazy because it literally was the golden age of comic books. Like, this was like a time where people actually consumed this stuff. And you got to think that this is before social media, right? For a comic book to people back then, I'd imagine it was like a 10-second reel, Instagram reel today, or a 10-cent TikTok video, or some kind of meme, right? That's kind of what it was. because you got to be like, this was before TV. This was before, you know, I mean, there was some radio, but there was no TV back then, and video games, those weren't a thing yet. So I thought it was kind of awesome. Also, it was interesting that the Comics Code of Authority also happened to be censoring them at the same time that TV was, you know, starting to become an affordable thing that people were putting in their household. And it was starting to see as a more common form of home entertainment. So like cartoons and stuff like that. So overall, it's a great book. I thought it was a great book. I kind of want to read The Seduction of the Innocent, but I'm going to have to read that in print. I don't know if I can listen to it. A guy just ranting about comic books and putting blame on stuff like that. I mean, I think it was kind of interesting that he was kind of making some of these psychological, you know, studies and like connections and stuff. But some of those were like very flimsy, like super flimsy. All right. But anyways, you guys let me know if you guys have read that book and what were some of the things that you took away from this book, if anything, and would you guys recommend it to new collectors? I highly recommend this book to new collectors. So anyways, that's my video, guys. So thank you guys for rocking with me, the guys that are always coming through, and I'll see you guys on the next one. All right, peace.